Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second in this series that has this title, Wild Times, that recognizes that this is a fairly turbulent time in human history. Lots of things are changing, lots of things are happening, and this is the second talk in the series, which began with life, birth, and will actually end with death. In between, we have a lot to do. And our strategy is to pull back a little bit from the current situation, the state of the world, the state of social controversies, issues about marriage, homosexuality, etc., etc. Pull back and set the stage that this is something that is happening in the flow of life, the flow of the universe. And we are members. This is our home. The universe is our home. And so we can ground ourselves and take some sense of confidence that what is happening is not completely crazy and is not destructive and horrible and that it's all going to hurt us. We can take some confidence in that the universe has made it this far abundantly, wonderfully, with plenty of troubles, no doubt, but also with plenty of wonder and success as well. We're all here. So that's the setting we should take and understand that the universe is dynamic. It's in motion. And we are in motion, and we can't stay still. And so these social changes, which can seem perhaps a little scary or a little hard to comprehend for some people, are happening because that's how life works. We are not living like our parents did. We are not living like our grandparents did. And there are changes that have always happened. And I want to say, during the course of this series, I hope to show that a lot of these changes are enormously beneficent. They were good changes. They were changes for the better. They brought with them better human well-being. Now, on the issue of the evolution of intimacy and family, this touches a lot of sensitive nerves, and I'm going to try to be as thoughtful about not touching sensitive nerves. I'm going to be taking primarily a scientific perspective, which means I'm going to look at how the family as we know it, which is more fundamentally a part of the human mating system, how we reproduce ourselves, how new people come into being. I want to look at that from a scientific perspective, which is to ask, how did it get here? What was going on before in the ancestors that we had, and indeed their ancestors back in the stream of life that we came from? So that's my perspective. Now, to get started, you're not going to be able to read all of this slide, but I hope you can appreciate what this is an attempt to lay out all of life on a page. And its starting point, you see that red dot? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So here is a starting point with the most simple single-celled organisms, or maybe even strands of RNA, which is the molecule of life that all organisms have. 3.8 million years ago, 3.8 billion years ago. So the the Earth is about 4 billion years ago, and life began rather soon after the formation of the Earth. And out of this now starts radiating, first of all of these different kinds of single-celled organisms, which are all quite simple. And as we come off of that, we come up to more complicated single-celled organisms, and we finally come to a point where very early on the multicellular organisms start to come about. These are little strange named creatures that you can find in the fossil record, and right at this point, about 1.8 billion years ago, sex is invented. Now, that's been very important, and most of the life that then flows out of that for plants and animals, that radiation takes place with sex. So what is the invention of sex about? As these plants and animals radiate up, I want to get to human beings. So if we follow all of these different strands, here's the plant strand for all the plants are over here. We're coming up here through all the fungi. Over here are animals. And coming up through here are fishes, and then finally mammals. And finally coming up the line here, we finally get to primates, like the New and Old World monkeys, and chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and human beings. And this branch is only about 15 million years old. It's very new. And finally here are human beings. And all of these are sexually reproducing. So what is sex about? Sex is about mixing and combining genes. And here's how it works. In a cell, there is a chromosome, which is a package of DNA. And that package of DNA has the instructions to how to build bodies and regulate behavior. And I think probably most of you know in this day and age that DNA is this very important molecule. It's got a double-stranded structure. It's got two strands that sort of spiral around one another, and all the information that's in one strand is in the other strand because it's hooked to it, and if you can read one of them, you can read the other. So when a cell is going to reproduce, get some help from enzymes and other molecules in the cell, the strand is unzipped, so to speak. You pull it apart, and now it's exposed. Molecular ends are open and ready to receive nucleotides. These are new ends, new letters that go with the DNA alphabet that will attach themselves. And the two unzipped structures, as they go through this process with the help of the enzymes, then become two new, completely whole DNA molecules with their double strands. And then the cell divides, and one of the strands goes with one part, and the other strand stays with the other part, and you have reproduced life. You have made new life. Now, the thing to notice about this is what happens then in the course of evolution is this cell now goes out. It's going to interact with all the other cells. Maybe some of them are like itself. Maybe some of them are different kinds of cells, different kinds of bacteria. They will all have to interact in the flow of life. And some of them will die without reproducing. Others will be pretty successful in that environment and will reproduce, and their genetic material will go on. Now, if a mutation happens on that DNA, and it happens to be a very bad mutation, that it hurts the reproductive capability of the cell will die, and so it gets washed away. But in the flow of these random mutations, some will come along that change things just a little bit in the cell's behavior so that it actually is superior. It actually works better. and it reproduces more abundantly, and that new DNA that has that change goes on. But that's the only way it can change, is with the interaction with other cells, either leading to an early death, or inhibiting its division, or through mutations in its DNA. But all these cells are doing the same number, and some of them are getting different mutations than others. Some of them may have hit on a mutation that's actually quite beneficial, and they're going gangbusters on that one. But if this cell over here doesn't have any access to that information, it's left out in the cold. Moreover, when a cell reproduces in this way where there's no sex, the buildup of bad mutations can sometimes never get completely washed out, because the cell can still reproduce, perhaps, but it's not got the function that it might have had if that gene had not lost its effect. So there's no way to sort of cleanse the cell of what are called deleterious mutations. Those are bad mutations. So what sex is about is that the cells now exchange information, so that this one's DNA, when you're going to reproduce, and this one's DNA could come together, put the two sets of DNA together, and pick and choose from them. Now this is done mostly randomly, but that's what sex is all about, is mixing genes from different cells that have had different experiences. Now this is the only explicitly raw sex picture I'm going to show. This is the sex act. This is the sex act of two DNA strands, and up here is a photomicrograph of the actual, up above is the actual, this is the actual nuclear, the genetic material. And what happens is, these chromosomes, first of all, I didn't quite make it clear that there's the double strand of DNA, but then those DNA strands are linked together so that there are a pair of what are called chromatids. So there's a pair of genes at every point. You might have heard of recessive genes and dominant genes. That's where that comes from, the fact that there's a choice of gene. And that's because the DNA is coiled up. Here's one of the strands in here. And there are a pair of them, and they're hooked by these little centromeres. So what happens in sex is that the chromosomes from one of the parents, we'll just say the male and the female, they come together and they kind of lay across each other, as you see there. And when they do that, when they go to reproduce, instead of this one just reproducing its old blue color, the enzyme that comes along here that is doing the reproduction hits this junction, it's called a chiasmata, and it switches and it goes over, and now this one has got the red one's DNA. And then it's back to blue here. And the blue one picked up this red DNA over here, and you see how they exchanged information. So this is what sex is about, is exchanging information in some fundamental way. So now, why sex? Why is there sex? The biologists have a word for this. It's called heterosis. It means that there's increased disease resistance in offspring that are sexually reproduced compared to those that aren't, because of this ability to gather information from different partners and to use it to build a better child cell. There's increased what's called hybrid vigor. That's again coming from this use of greater amounts of information that cells have had to figure out in the environment that they're living in. It's not just coming from one cell. There's the removal of destructive genes. When you saw back here, when this blue guy here, say that was the female, picked up this from the male, it lost the blue section here. It's no longer there. And if there was a bad gene on that section, it's gone too. So that's how the deleterious genes are cleaned. And in general, stronger, more productive offspring. So, because of the heterosis of sex, the natural state of life, given the genetic origins of sex, should be a promiscuous mating system. That means that all of the participants are trying to hook up with as many of the other participants as possible, because that way they pool all of their information from the environment and use it together. So we should have lots of promiscuous sex. That would be the natural state. That's not the natural, that doesn't quite happen at all. But if that was the case, we'd have lots of creatures displaying themselves, saying, look at me, I'm the one you want to mate with, come over here. And also, animals would display and advertise when they were estrus and were ready for sex. They would display it by the way their bodies behaved. And this is a female hyena who is in estrus and is displaying in this rather prominent way, I'm ready for sex. But that's not the way it works. Promiscuity is invaded by many things. First of all, I think you can see that if some genes arise that predispose an organism to polarize itself around other organisms and keep others out, especially if those other organisms are of the opposite sex, then it is preferentially sending its genes forward over the other ones who are not having so many of the opposite sex. And generally, this happens almost always with the male polarizing a group of females around him. But not always. What it really comes down to, and I'll explain this in a moment, is the partner who devotes most of the resources to the raising of the young is the one who gets polarized by the one who gives the lesser amount. So, polygyny is that male taking over and grabbing a bunch of females. Rape, where the male forces himself on the female. And this can be taking place at the level of insects, at the level of other kinds of animals. We're not talking quite so humanly here. But it also happens with human beings. The other things are mate guarding, that is where, again, the male will guard the female that he's mated with so no other males can mate with her. Infanticide, if he hasn't successfully guarded and a female has got a child that has been fathered by a different male, he can kill it. And then that male's genes don't go forward because they've been stopped. This is typical of several kinds of animals that practice polygamy, like gorillas, and certain kinds of baboons are also very polygamous and very violent. So when a gorilla takes over a new harem that he may have killed the previous owner of, the first thing he does is kill all the infants. And that way, the new infants that will be born will be with his genes. So, infanticide, another one is sperm removal. There are many kinds of animals that actually will remove the sperm in the female And there's another phenomenon called sperm blocking. Many kinds of animals and insects will actually, after they inseminate a female, will have a kind of blocking compound that gets put in the female tract so that she can't be inseminated again. There are also fruit flies will, after they inseminate a female, will actually inseminate with a toxin that their sperm is not sensitive to, but other males are, and would kill the sperm of other males. That toxin is also hard on the female. So all of this is about one sex monopolizing, sending its genes forward. And the innovation of sex is open to that possibility. There's no way you can stop that particularly. So all of these good things about heterosity, about sharing these genes that lead to stronger and more productive offspring, that is got to contend with this ability of one of the sexes to control the situation and dominate, sending its genes forward over others. There's a second thing that happens that's really even more important. It's got also a big word attached to it. We need some big words to throw around when we're talking about sex, because otherwise the words sound too embarrassing. So, anisogamy. What this is about, the ani means something unequal. So, and gametes are the offspring. So, there's an unequal sharing of parenting costs by the mates. The partner with less parenting has more time for sex. And just as a note here, human beings have some of the highest parenting costs in nature. 9 months of pregnancy. A large part of the woman's energy goes into that pregnancy. And then 3 years, and for our hunter-gatherer ancestors, maybe up to 4 years of lactation. This is a big tie-up of her life. So she's contributing an enormous amount to the offspring. Whereas the male, if there were no other constraints, is contributing a couple of grams of sperm and a minute or more of his time.
No more than a minute in these cases.
I just want to illustrate this problem of unequal contributions of parenting, because it's so fundamental to why we don't have a promiscuous mating system. This is a pendulum tit. It's a songbird that lives in southern Europe. And birds are rather important kind of creatures to look at in relationship to the human mating system, because birds have a big investment in reproduction, because they have to grow the eggs, they have to hatch them, they have to feed the young before the young are able to live on their own. So there's a lot of parenting involved for birds. And there's a lot of parenting involved for humans. So how do these birds manage this? Well, this bird, both the male and the female, will mate together, and they are somewhat monogamous, but they're not fully monogamous. They will also try to have matings with other birds, and neither of them likes it. The male will try to guard the female to prevent her from going off, but he goes off on his own, and then she goes off on her own. And she lays eggs. The male watches and guards the nest, and he will not let any other male near her while he's guarding the nest, but that's not going to stop her. And she will also try to hide eggs in the nest. She'll try to hide an egg or two in the nest, because what these birds do is when they see the nest is just about full of eggs, they both have a strong incentive to take off. One of them will take off on the other. And the remaining bird has a lot of pressure to hatch those eggs, because all her genes are in there, or all his genes are in there if she took off. And when they do that, and the birds struggle to do that, they don't raise very successful clutches. But sometimes they will also both contribute. Maybe in about 60% of the cases, they will both contribute and they will both raise a successful clutch. There's another 30% of the cases in which they will both abandon the nest, let the eggs die. And people have studied these birds and found that that strategy is not all that bad as a mating strategy, because they have a large number of clutches. They raise about 5 to 6 clutches per year. It's a lot of clutches. There are some birds that only have one. And so there's lots of new opportunities. If that clutch didn't work out, neither of those birds had quite the right genetic disposition and the feel of wanting to stick it out, and they lost it, there's still another chance. And these birds are very successful, and they populate a whole lot of southern Europe, all through the Balkans, into Turkey, up into Asia. Very, very robust bird. But that's one extreme. Now, because of this, because sex makes it possible to have competition and cooperation, you can achieve things with cooperation that you can't achieve with competition. And it's also true that you can achieve things with competition that cooperation won't bring. But I want to look now at mating cooperation and parenting cooperation rather than just straight competition. Do we have some examples of that in nature? And we do. These are razorbills. They are a shorebird, lives on the Atlantic Ocean in northern Europe. And these are a mating pair. These birds are neither completely monogamous nor completely promiscuous. They kind of have it all mixed up. They live in a large colony called an arena where they hang out. This is the social scene for razorbills. And they also make nests up in the rocks. There are monogamous pairs who have mated together before, in the season before, and they build a nest in the rocks. And they could mate up at their nest, but they instead choose to come down to the scene down here and mate down there. Now, these males are not that aggressive about other males, and the females are willing to accept other pair copulations. The result is that, and also there's quite a bit of male-on-male mounting, homosexual male behavior. So there's quite a mix-up of stuff going on here. But one of the things that's notable that I think people should need to, the researchers who work on this certainly think about, it's all in the open. So all these birds know who's with who. And they also can see how other birds behave. They are, in a way, checking out other birds while they're all in the process of mating, because the females in some way are trying to want to find a mate who's going to help with the raising of the young. And there are cues that the males obviously give off, even in the process of mating, that give a little indication of how that's going to go. There's another bird, also a shore bird up on the northern Atlantic. These are sandpipers, although these are males that are both showing their sexual display. And these males are on the coast of Finland. So these are like sandpiper birds, you know, the sandpipers that run along the shore. There are two distinct kinds of males, not just one. And one of them has the white plume, and one of them has they're called ruffs, because these look a lot like the Elizabethan ruffs that were common in England. So one has the dark ruff, and one has the light ruff. Now the dark ruff, he's the big alpha male guy. The way these birds mate is with what's called the lek. So the male will kind of stake out a little territory, and they also are all pretty close to proximity, so there's like these little subcategories. Maybe it's like a fair, where you're walking through the fair and everybody's there, but there's all these booths. So these males all have their own little booths set up, so to speak. And the males are chasing away other males that have this dark-colored ruff. Get out of here, you're not wanted. And the females are walking around trying to figure out if they want to check into one of these mating areas. But these guys are also present. And if one of them shows up, he does a little bow, and the dark-colored guy gives a little bow back, which basically says, you can come in. Now, when he comes in, he's going to be somehow the secondary male, but he somehow has a deal going with the females, that they kind of like the way he behaves. And a female is more likely to come and visit the big guy's mating area if he has one of these with him, and he in turn lets the white ruffed male have some copulations. And he sometimes will say, that's enough, too much for you. It's obviously not everything completely cool. There's a little bit of tension involved. But by and large, these three actors, the female, the white male, and the dark male, manage to do a dance together that makes new sandpipers. And it's worth noting that they're successful at this kind of procedure. And let's make one last example here. These are sunfish. These are common bluegill, which are very common around here. Now the bluegill, there's a bluegill male. The way the mating system with bluegill work is the male is going to make the nest. And he's going to sort of scour out a little bit of gravel in a pond and hang out there and wait for a female to come along and say, well, I like what you've got there, and I will come in and lay eggs. Meanwhile, there are a lot of other smaller male bluegill that are quite still small that want to get in there when the female shows up, and they want to get in there and they want to sneak in and squirt some sperm on those eggs. And the big guy doesn't want them to do that. He's trying to chase them out. Well, in the meanwhile, somehow out of the blue, a little medium-sized male shows up. And there are these different sized bluegill. And the big guy is rather tolerant of him. And the female is quite happy to have him there too. There's something about that medium-sized bluegill that the female finds very acceptable, maybe more acceptable than the big guy. And they will execute a courtship in which all three will flow together, and the two males will lay sperm on the female's eggs as she lays them. Group sex. All right. So what's going on here? What we really are discovering is that there is a twofold aspect of mating. The first is there's the transfer of sperm. But the second is there's something going on about building and maintaining social relationships. Females choose well-connected genes revealed by a male's behavior. And females distribute paternity over several males, as in the razor bills, to assure well-being of their young. One of the things that would happen if they didn't is that razor bills might be tempted to attack the nest and kill the young, infanticide. But if the razor bills have an investment in the paternity of that nest, and they don't know whose egg is whose, then there's a natural evolution of behavior to not practice infanticide. So, and the females have obviously evolved to know that. Okay, well, now let's see about human beings. We have, in the 1 million year history of our species of Homo sapiens, probably mainly progressed through. There might possibly have been a polygynous, kind of a combination polygynous, promiscuous system, but probably for most of the 250,000 years of modern humans that have the brain about the size that we have, it has been polygynous. So there's polygyny with mate guarding, and also in cultured humanity, where there's a culture to support the underlying biology, taking prepubescent wives. So people that are involved in a polygynous society, the males want prepubescent wives, and they obviously do mate guarding, and they practice polygamy. This is actually a recent scene, a modern scene from northern Pakistan. What's the oldest profession in the world? It's selling your daughter. That may be the second oldest, but selling your daughter is the first. This is a poor Pashtun family. This is the dad here. This is a village elder here. These are his sons. And this is the man who has just purchased his 11-year-old daughter. Now, why is this man selling his daughter? Well, why do people sell daughters all over the world, especially if they're poor? A daughter, especially if she's approaching puberty, is a liability. If she gets pregnant, who's going to take care of that child? You already have a lot of children. You can't take care of any more children. And no man is going to want her. She is a bad thing to have. So, in addition, in a polygynous society, there is a shortage of women because the bunch of males who could provide husbandry for those females are cut out of the market by the big guys who have the money. So that's why this man is going to collect some money. He'd rather have the money to raise maybe the rest of this family, and his daughter will become the wife of this 40-year-old man. Now, why does he want an 11-year-old? Because men have been programmed with the genetic programming that tells them they are not going to care for any other man's genes. Their genes are going to go forward. They're going to put resources into those genes, and the last thing they want is any other man's genes. They don't think this. That's not the calculation they're doing. It's a culturally inbred pattern that is riding on the underlying biology. So here are the husband and wife, and he may leave her at home for a while if he's pretty confident that she's not going to have any access to other males, but he eventually will take her as a wife. And as far as mate guarding goes, here's some mate guarding where the women are completely covered up so that nobody else can see them. These are probably all either, these women have husbands or fathers who are very concerned about their fertility and that it not be given away cheaply, but it be sold properly and owned properly. Now, there's also the male-driven mating strategy that is not quite so nice. I mean, I don't think, here in the West, we do not think this is a very nice mating system. But let us be clear that this is very much more closely related to how we got here. We came here from ancestors who were polygamous and who practiced these kinds of things. So, rape, infanticide, and sperm removal. I didn't say much about that, and you might be interested to know that that's another male-driven mating strategy, and even us modern men have that as a legacy. The shape of the male penis and the coronal ridge that exists at the tip actually has a function that in the course of intercourse it will sweep any previous sperm in the vaginal canal out. And numerous tests with models as well as in vitro have confirmed that that does happen. It's not a big effect, it's not the dominant effect, but nature is full of all kinds of small little things that go on. Now, this is not completely a male show. Females have an important role to play. And the female response to this male strategy, and bear in mind, so little of this is in anybody's head. Nobody's thinking about this the way I'm talking to you about it. It's all internalized in the emotional system that we inherit and the culture that rides on top of it. So, one of the things that's interesting is in the hyena you saw, and in many, many animals, ovulation is advertised. Females advertise when they're fertile. But human females have evolved concealed ovulation. And the general understanding is that is a female response against infanticide. If the males don't know who is carrying their child because they don't know when the woman is fertile, then it obscures paternity. And that is an aid and a defense against infanticide. The other thing that's interesting about humans is that we have sex in private. We have concealed sex as well as concealed ovulation. And one of the thoughts is that in the precursor societies that came before us, you had the alpha male who was again dominating the mating system. But the females, and we still see this in, say, chimpanzee and bonobo animals, the females are not all that wanting to just go with the alpha male. They are attracted to other secondary males. But the alpha male is trying to stop that. So in case of chimpanzees and bonobos, it's very difficult because of the environment that they live in for the male to control everything. A gorilla can because of the ecosystem that he's involved in. There are no other gorillas around for a long while, and he's got 6 females in his harem. It's not a big deal to control them. But a chimpanzee's got a troop of like 30, and they have access to fruit trees, and they eat all kinds of things, not like those poor gorillas which just have to eat leaves. And so there's a lot of mobility, And so a female and a male will sneak off, hide, have sex in private, not out in public. Whereas most of the matings that the alpha has are completely in public. So that's the other thing that's come about is evasion of alpha male may be the explanation. There may be other explanations of concealed sex, but it's a notable feature of human mating systems. A third female response is orgasm, which is related to sperm selection. Now this has more to do perhaps with our ancestral situations in which there was a certain amount of promiscuity, in which female orgasm actually, the muscular contractions actually will move forward the sperm at that time towards the cervix. So it's almost like, I mean, I'll go ahead and say it, the female is in some sense, her body's saying, I like you, and I'm going to take your sperm in a little closer. So that's another female response. But by and large, the most important one is monogamy that comes from another thing that's unique to human beings, which is continuous sexual receptivity of females. Females are always sexual. Maybe not so much when they're menstruating, and certainly not when they're in final stages of pregnancy. But by and large, females are willing to have sex all the time, and that is just about unique in the animal world. And one of the theories is that that's the way she keeps her mate interested and stimulates and renews the emotional bonding that comes from sex. And monogamy is probably the best system until we can do something like birds or something of that sort. But compared to polygamy and promiscuity, in the present state of humanity, monogamy has shown itself to be probably the best form of reproductive success. So, the mating systems are promiscuous, polygamous, have a male having a harem. I put a little nod to polyandry here, which is where one female has several male mates. It does occur, but it's very small. One of the places it occurs in the high Arctic among the Inuit, where life is very severe and a female who is pregnant needs help from more than just one man. So we have a little polyandry there, but not much. And then a monogamous system. But the thing to take note of is that mating systems are never completely exclusive. There's some mix of promiscuity, polygamy, and monogamy, although one usually dominates. I want to alert you again to heterosity. That's that underlying pressure, that underlying biological pressure to mix it up, to get some samples of other genetic material. And it is pushing all the time, bubbling up underneath. People think that sometimes human beings do crazy things. Why did Elliot Spitzer get the prostitute, and why did he wreck his life? Why do men wreck their lives? Why do women wreck their lives? There's something pushing. And we also know, I think from our own experience, or at least most people do, that new sexual partners are exciting. If you want to stay strictly monogamous, that's fine. Your first monogamous sex partner was enormously exciting. And we are attracted, even when we are in monogamous relationships, if we're honest about it, we are attracted by the glance of another person, or a person's tone of voice, or smile, or just their way of being that sort of touches us in some way. There's an attraction. Doesn't have to be acted upon, but it's there. And it's there because nature has got this underlying movement for mixing people together. So just for the history now, we had a common ancestor for gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans about 10 million years ago. All these other primates broke off earlier. All the monkeys, the gibbons, orangs. Gorillas, chimpanzees, humans. And in the chimpanzees, we should also think of bonobos. It's a smaller chimpanzee. So, the polygamy was a male-dominant patriarchy, but it had one thing that I think gives polygamy staying power. It had a way that females could work together and share child rearing. The dominant male who's running the harem may contribute very little, but there's no doubt that a group of females who actually can cooperate and work together will be more successful at raising their children than if they were stuck off by themselves in a nuclear family. And I think that's one of the reasons why women are not quite as resistant to polygamy as we might think they should be. And polygamy does have staying power. We have large parts of Africa, particularly Africa, and other parts of the world do have little clusters of polygamy, and we have it in America. There are, in the Americas, there is still a fairly vigorous group of polygamous Mormon fundamentalists who were disowned by the Mormon Church back in 1909, I believe. But they have kept on holding to the true faith. And they are clustered in pretty remote parts of the Southwest in New Mexico and Arizona. And there's also a colony up in Canada. And they still practice quite vigorous polygamy with one big head man and men can sire up to 30, 40 children. They also acquire wives at very young ages. So the other thing is, what about all of the men who don't get women in polygamy? Do they just lump it? No, polygamy, I think, one of the aspects of its modern decline, I think, has to do with violence. The males who don't have access to women are going to get together. They're going to get together and they're going to make a team or a gang, and eventually they're going to go and see if they can't overthrow one of these males and take over. And the Bible will tell you how it's done. If you read the book of Samuel, you can find the story of Saul and David. Saul was the king, he was the big guy, and David was the new guy. David was not having a whole bunch of wives like Saul. But David had a lot of guys that wanted to gang up with him. And pretty soon David has got a gang, and Saul is kind of worried, and they basically chase each other throughout the book of Samuel until finally Saul is killed, but he's actually killed in a battle with another tribe. He's not actually killed by David. But the interesting thing to keep your eye on is what happens to the women. Keep your eye on the money. On the Bible, keep your eye on the women. David takes over all of Saul's wives. So polygamy is a very violent-prone system, and we can see that in northern Pakistan and places where it's still practiced, and even in Africa where it's practiced, it still can lead to very violent behavior because of the way it cuts out a whole bunch of men. So monogamy, the other one, is decreased male-male violence, Male care for young through emotional bonding to continuously receptive females. So we had the common ancestor about 11 million years ago who was probably promiscuous. The gorilla came off of that, and because of its habitat, I think in large measure became polygamous, and pretty violently so. The chimp and bonobo stayed promiscuous. They have a promiscuous mating system. And then we get human beings where everything's pretty mixed up. It's obviously evolved from polygamous to monogamous, and maybe even in the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, fairly recently. In some places it hadn't evolved yet at all, like the places I mentioned. And plus, a little bit down here I put promiscuous, because of this continuous pressure of heterosity. So let's just sum up again what's really characteristic of the modern human mating system. Concealed ovulation, private sex, continuous female receptivity, and one I didn't mention, face-to-face copulation, because no other animals do that except for bonobos. Now, I think another reason for that is the serious importance of emotional bonding and the building of a set of relationships and connections between the partners, for which faces are very important. So I don't think it's an accident that is face-to-face. So the modern human mating system strongly exhibits the twofold aspect of sex, which is gotta transfer sperm. You don't do that, you're not getting anywhere. But the other purpose is for a sex beyond reproduction, forming and maintaining physically nourished social relationships for the well-being of both the individual and the group. And we saw that with the razor bills and with the ruffs. So now, let's talk about homosexuality as another part of this, because we saw homosexual behavior in those birds. So I've listed here where you find homosexuality in the animal world, and I could go on and on and on, but I'm only listing those that have been scientifically studied and documented. Just about everybody is included. Wolves, grizzly bears, dolphins, whales, black bear, some more so than others, some less so, but it's always present. So some people would say, well, homosexuality is completely unnatural because you don't make babies that way. So don't be dumb. How can you be so dumb? They're missing the very powerful way in which sex plays a social role, connecting the parents of offspring and connecting the mating society that they are part of. This is a very big deal. And homosexuality fits into the second function of sex, which is the formation of social bonds and relationships for the well-being of the individual and the group. So, maybe we could move past sex as conflict to sex as cooperation. Sex for lovemaking is consolation, sharing, support. These are all healthy things that make for strong relationships that can raise children. And even after children are gone, people still live. People still need consolation, support, sharing. Think of it as participation in the life of the universe. Think of it as exuberant prayer. Think of lovemaking as joyous gratitude for the gift of life. And there we shall end. Well, I hope there's some questions. Don't be embarrassed. Yes.
One section on human mating, modern human mating.
Yes.
And there was one slide that said something about emotional bonding.
Yes.
But I didn't see what it said. It was near the bottom of the screen.
It said emotional bonding.
You have to remember what.
Oh, it might have said something about the strengthening and nurturing of relationships for well-being.
Okay, that's fine.
Strengthening and nurturing of relationships for well-being. Yes.
Could you just explain, and maybe I missed it, maybe you explained it, the sperm removal? Did I
Yes.
hear you say there are animals that do secrete some type of
Block.
block?
Yes.
And
Mostly insects.
Insects.
Yes. No, but chimpanzees will try to do that. Yeah.
But if we all know there's nothing, you know what I'm getting to here, the political thing out. There's nothing in the female body to keep a woman from getting pregnant when she's raped. I'm not
No, the
anything.
male puts that block in, not the female.
Oh, the male's doing the block in.
Yes, the male's putting that block in.
Okay.
Yeah, not the female. In fact, no. But females do have some choice.
Could you tell me where that actually came from? Because these people are saying they have scientific knowledge that this is true. How far back are they going to even get this idea in their head?
Well, I think if you read the national press, the American Academy of Obstetricians, the scientific community just said this is nonsense. So I'm not going to go any farther than
Okay,
that.
I was just wondering, was it something that I missed that they were saying that I knew it was stupid, but
It's
you know me,
nonsense.
I like to investigate
It's-
things.
Yes.
I don't have a question, but just a comment.
Yes. Do share comments too.
To say how wonderfully you presented this subject. It was really great, and I think you did a superior job.
Oh, well, thank you. I think it's an important subject, and it's one that people have a lot of difficulty talking about. Incidentally, I have a thought about that. I had a thought about that. Why is it so difficult to talk about sex? And why is it difficult for parents to talk about sex to their children? And I think it's because, first of all, sex is private. We have evolved private sex. And the other is, especially with children, we don't want that kind of coloration of the conversation, that kind of ambience, to be in the presence of parents and children, because it starts to touch on the incest taboo. And I was terrible about talking about sex with my children. I was very young. I could do better now, but it's not the time. So I think there's first of all a kind of reasonable explanation of why it's so difficult to talk about sex, both in general, although we can talk about it in the most calloused way. If you've ever been in a male locker room, you know what I'm talking about. We can talk about it in the most commercial, abusive way. We can plaster women's bodies all over the place. We can have an internet that is full of nonstop porn. And yet, if you want to talk sensibly and reasonably about sex, well, maybe this is the Reynolds Homestead. We should be careful about what we say. So it's not unreasonable, I think, because of the privacy and the incest taboo, the kind of nervousness. What's more curious is the abusive talk about sex that has common currency. That it's very hard to really weigh in against that. The other thing that's really, I think, quite important, when you study hunter-gatherer tribes, and you ask the question, well, how do these children learn about sex? Well, what you find is the parents don't tell them a thing. So I didn't feel so badly. These are the Kung-san, which is a hunter-gatherer tribe, African hunter-gatherer tribe, studied by Melvin Connor. And he describes that the compound of the Kung-san involve individual family huts that surround an area that is closed off from the rest of the jungle. And all the children hang out, and obviously adults can go back and forth, but it's like the public square. But the public square is full of children. So the public square has all these kids from toddlers up through pubescence. And Connor reports that the way kids learn about sex is from other kids. That's how they do it. But isn't that how a whole lot of people learn about sex? Not from their parents, but from other kids. And he said, they don't play doctor, they play sex. And fortunately, it's actually rather difficult for very young women in hunter-gatherer societies like that, because of the kind of nutritional levels and so forth. It's actually very difficult for them to get pregnant. They don't get pregnant so easily. So that's a kind of story about why it's difficult to talk about sex. Any other observations or comments? Yes?
We got one observation and one question. One is the idea of the continuously receptive female is contradicted by Dear Abby and Ann Landers, if you read their columns, on a regular basis. I assume you're talking is very going up in broad generalities.
What's that?
You're speaking in broad generalities when you talk about the continuously receptive female.
I was getting ready to say that.
But even if you read Dear Abby and Ann Landers, that would contradict.
Oh. Yes, these are monogamous relationships, right?
Right.
And maybe, well, I don't have a slide about it, but I'm glad you mentioned that. There is something tragic about human sexuality. There is something tragic about it, as well as wondrous. And that tragedy is what is the stuff of great novels, like Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, or any number of even not so great stories and television dramas and you name it. What it's all about is cheating or not, or the struggle. And the reason it's there is because, as in many things in nature, there is a balance of two opposing forces. The heterosity force. Do you remember what heterosity is? That's the bubbling up of wanting to sample other genes. That heterosity force is contrary to the exclusive monogamy force, which is needed for raising the young. So I can say with full assuredness, promiscuity is good for children. And I can say also that it's bad for children. And I can say that monogamy is good for children. But I can also say that very strict monogamy might be bad for children. Very difficult. This is a very difficult issue to deal with. And you get a lot of tragedy out of it. Tolstoy, when he was writing Anna Karenina, Tolstoy was quite a moralist. And he wanted to write a story about a woman who... How many people know the story of Anna Karenina? A little bit, maybe. Yes. It's a story about a woman who is married to a fairly high-class Russian bureaucrat. And has a son with him. And is just suddenly enamored with this chasseur named Vronsky. And he is just, she just can't take her eyes off him, and he is interested in her, and she gets into a liaison with him, and the whole book is about this, and it ends with her suicide. She throws herself under a train. And you weep through a lot of parts of this book when he writes about Karenin, her husband, who you could think of as just, this bureaucrat, and he's got business, and he had these funny ears. And yet your heart kind of goes out to him because of what he's suffering through. And your heart certainly goes out to Anna. And Tolstoy said, he admitted, he said, I didn't want to like her, but I fell in love with her. One last chance, one last observation we missed. Yes.
Do you think people are born genetically with more of a need to be promiscuous, or one?
Yes.
Is there a continuum?
Yeah, very good question. I'm so glad you asked that question. Did everybody hear her? Anybody who did not hear the question? Okay.
I didn't hear it very clearly.
The question is, are there some people who are born with a more innate tendency for promiscuity and, equally, a more innate tendency for monogamy? And the question could be asked for both males and females. That's a very good question. In the birds that I described, the razor bills, and I think this is true for the ruffs as well. The females would be solicited for what are called ECPs in the biological world, extra copulatory, extra couple, I don't know, it's out of wedlock, so to speak, copulations. And they found that some females, that the population was really pretty mixed. There were fairly males that tended to be mate guarders who wanted to guard the nest and did not engage in that much extra pair copulation. That's it, extra pair copulation. And then there were males who were quite happy to engage in extra pair copulations. What I'm not quite sure about is the delivery of food to the nestlings for that particular kind of male. I didn't read about any particular loss of that capacity. And then there were the females who were always ready to mate with another male who was interested, and they were interested in. The more monogamous females were like that for 2 years in a row, because the biologists studied them for more than just one mating season. And the birds seem to keep their characteristics of being slightly more promiscuous or slightly more monogamous. But that's a very good question. I think, we have this whole constellation of behaviors that are dialed, and we all come in with the genetic dial set a little differently on each one, but none of them is running the show completely. And some of us are probably tuned up a little bit more that way. But it also means you're going to have the grit to bear the heartache and the hurt and so on. I was originally trained before I did graduate study as an engineer. I like to fix things. I like to, if you don't have any way of getting around, maybe if we made something called a car, it would be kind of handy to have. I like to build and fix things. And I've often thought, well, if there was a way in which people could emotionally assure one another and really be bound to it because they want to do that, they're caught in it, their care for young that was separate from their mating. Maybe you could have both, but our human society and our behavior is like a ship. It's like a ship that's got problems. And you try to say, well, we should fix it. Well, you can't take the ship apart because it's already in the water. Our system is a ship that's sailing. And if you're going to fix it, you kind of have to take it one plank at a time. You can't turn it all upside down. It's still a pretty big turn upside down for people to freely practice sexual mating with others at the same time they're trying to raise children. That's a very hard deal. So instead, they lie, they can't help themselves, they apologize, they're so sorry, they won't do it again. There's a lot of stress. And to some extent, that's life. It's life. But I would say if you have found your way to it, by however you've done it, if you have a vibrant, monogamous sexual relationship, you have something very precious. Good question. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for your generous and gracious comment. And the next lecture actually ties to this one somewhat, a little bit. It's going to be about women and the rise of women and their ability to have power and to control their lives in ways that they have never had before. And I'm inviting my companion Anna Zilborg to join me in that lecture, because I don't think a man should be the one doing most of the talking about that. And that will be in about a month, the third week of the month of November. November 18th. So I hope you'll all come back, and I hope you'll tell your friends, and I hope that you'll encourage them that Wild Times is a very worthwhile thing to come and listen to. So we can have some refreshments.